Hello, this is Father Hightower, and welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We are so pleased that you have joined us. Your participation enriches our entire community. We hope that our show serves as a point of light, helping to deepen our understanding and experience of the Catholic faith in history. So join us as we seek through prayer, study, interviews, and discussion the roots of the practice of our faith. God bless.
Hello. Welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We're so very pleased you could be with us today. Our episode today is a continuation of our three-part series on the Eucharistic Congress in the Diocese of Helena, over at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. This was the day where we had the majority of the activities, festivities, and presentations that were available to us. You'll hear a little bit later that there were breakout sessions, which, as apart from the general sessions where we were all together, and that is all different age groups, that was the adults, the middle schoolers, the high schoolers, but during the breakout sessions, everybody kind of went their own way. There were classes that were available for the older folks, there were classes that were available for the younger folks, and even if you did go to the classes as the older folks, you had a plethora of choices to pick between. I think there were 7 rooms that were all active, and they each had 3 sessions apiece. Now, some presenters did 2 sessions in a row just so that people could get them and not have to miss them, but there was so much going on that it would have been hard to be able to make all of it in one go. In fact, it would have been downright impossible. We were lucky that last episode, or yesterday, when these recordings were taken, that we were able to have Dr. John Reese on because he was one of the presenters during this episode that I unfortunately had to miss. But thankfully, we were able to snag him yesterday, so that was a fair bit of luck on my part to just have seen him from across the hall and said, "Hey, isn't that one of the guys on this here pamphlet?" And sure enough, it was. So I'm glad that we were able to grab him and have him on, but there were several other presenters that I would have loved to be able to not only attend their breakout session, but certainly get them behind the microphone and get an interview in with them. And hopefully next year, if they're still there or if they're giving similar presentations, I can track them down at that point. It's one of the few downsides with there only being one of me and so much to do is that there's a lot of stuff that I end up having to miss simply because I am confined to one finite space. But for today, we're going to be hearing from 3 individuals that really made a big difference at this particular Congress. The first one was a young lady named Brooke, who is a high schooler there in Helena, Montana. And when I heard her testimony of her conversion during one of the early presentations, I simply could not let her go off to the high school stuff without first asking her for an interview, because I found this to be a very inspiring story, and I hope you will too. The second interview was one of the main keynote speakers for the Congress, Dr. Charles Camosy. And he is a well-known personality in the national circuit, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get a few moments with him, and we were able to sit down, and he does not pull punches, Dr. Camosy, when it comes to speaking about controversial topics, or topics that might make some people a little uncomfortable. But when I say this, I mean people who aren't necessarily looking at these topics or at, if I dare use the dirty word, politics, from the Catholic point of view. Because as he points out, if you are truly living the Catholic life here in America, if we're really trying to represent our values, well, then we're going to upset people both on the left and on the right because of the way that our teachings don't really fall into the American political spectrum. And this is something that I'll let him talk about a little bit more, but I found it absolutely fascinating to hear from somebody whose stance on Catholicism was not in any way linked to any sort of political ideology. And I found that refreshing, so I hope you do as well. And then lastly, we're going to be finishing with these 2 wonderful Dominican sisters out of Nashville, Tennessee, who were able to sit down and share with me the story of hope and how pilgrims of hope function during this year of Jubilee. And before we go much further, I do want to give a heads up and an apology both to the sisters and you, our dear listeners, that when we get to their section of this particular episode, you're going to notice that the sound does something strange. You're going to hear like a rhythmic fan in the background, as well as muted ranges on both the high and the low. The reason for this is there was an industrial fan that was going in the background when I was able to sit down with them to speak. And Sister Mariana, you're gonna be shaking your head at me, because I remember her looking over her shoulder and going, "Do you think that's going to be a problem?" And I went, "Nah, it should be fine." Well, sister, you were absolutely right. So I do hope that you're able to kind of suffer through the audio quality, because the interview that they gave was really quite incredible, and I think you'll get a lot of joy out of it. We were really lucky this year to have the wonderful presenters that we did, and to have the attendance that we did, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of just quality of people. In this particular day, walking around, I met so many good, quality people. Folks who were more than willing, if you were looking around and saying, "Okay, where am I going to sit for a meal?" They flag you down and say, "Hey, do you have a place to sit? Come sit with us." Not knowing me from Adam, not knowing me from anybody else there, but just seeing that I was questioning where I should be, and them saying, "Come be here with us." And that was the sort of people that I encountered at this Congress, were people who were living in the spirit of Christ and really feeling the point of it all. So I think I've yammered on long enough, so let's dig right in to this second day of the Eucharistic Congress in the Diocese of Helena.
Well, I've risen and had my adequate breakfast here at the hotel, preparing to go in for a long day. The activities for today range from 9 in the morning till 9 in the evening, so that means we're probably going to have about a 12-hour day. But I'm excited for it. There's a lot of different sessions that are planned for it, what they call the breakout sessions, and I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of these presentations. It should be fun. And then, of course, I've got some excellent interviews planned for today. I know that Dr. Camosy and the Dominican sisters are definitely going to be on, but I'm going to see if I can't steal one or two more as well. And then, of course, you're going to hear my commentary as we kind of go throughout the day, and I experience the things and want to let you all know about them. So, about to head out, but hope you're all having a wonderful day. I know I'm about to, and here we go. I'm here with Brooke Volertson, who just gave an amazing speech here at the Eucharistic Congress on her conversion. And I thought that I couldn't walk away without capturing it for you all. So, Brooke, would you mind taking it from here?
Yeah, I would love to. My name is Brooke Volertson. I'm 16. I'm a sophomore at St. Andrew High School here in Helena, Montana. A year ago today, I would have given anything to have the Eucharist. I grew up Christian. I was baptized. We would go to church every once in a while, but it was never really something that was the center of my life. So that was just my entire relationship with God growing up. I would pray maybe once or twice a month, and then I'd forget about it, and then I'd be like, "Oh yeah, I should pray again today." And then that was just my entire relationship with God. All of that changed when I was in 5th grade, and that was the year of COVID. COVID happened, we went out for spring break and just never came back. So my parents decided to send me to St. Andrew School for 6th grade. And the first thing that happened when I walked in the classroom is we all stood up for morning prayer. It started off in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I was absolutely lost. I'd never been in a religious environment before. I'd never really met religious people. I honestly had never even heard of Catholicism before this point. But all through it, after a few weeks, I just started to feel this tug of like, why am I here? So I started to memorize the words to the prayers. We did it every day, so I got pretty good at it. And we would also go to Mass at St. Cyril's here in East Helena every Wednesday as a school. And so I started to learn the words to the Mass as well. And that was basically how it was for a while. Then, I did all the Catholic things, and one of those Catholic things was Legendary Lodge. the moment that I knew that I needed to come into the church and be with God through that was at candlelit Mass at Legendary Lodge. I just remember I was kneeling and I was looking up at the Eucharist, and then I was looking back at all of my friends. And I just remember thinking, Lord, I want that. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever looked up at Jesus and thought, I want you? So about a week later, I told my parents, I was like, Mom, Dad, I want to join the Catholic Church. And they were like, okay, sounds good. And I was like, wow, thank goodness I have such amazing parents, but it just felt too easy. So I started going to youth group, and I was going to join the church that Easter through that. But, life gets busy, and it just didn't end up working out. I really started despairing for a while, because I was like, Lord, I know what I want. I know what I need. I know what's true. I know what you want. But I just can't have you. And it was really hard, because I was kind of living in this weird in-between, where it was like, I wanted to be Catholic, but I just couldn't. And so I would participate in everything but the sacraments. And that was one of the most difficult times of my life. So that hunger started to grow, and it did for about a year, until again I told my parents, I was like, Mom, Dad, I will do anything, go anywhere, just please drive me so I can join the Catholic Church. And they told me, they were like, okay, yeah, let's do this. We'll start going to some classes at St. Cyril's, since you used to it, and because that's where you went to Mass with your school, and we'll join the church at Easter, do that. And I was just like, we? And they were like, yeah, we want to be united as a family, and we want to be united with our community, the St. Andrew community, and we know that this is where we're meant to be. And so we did. We started going to these classes, and all throughout I just had this sinking doubt that something's going to go wrong, it wasn't going to end up working out, it wasn't going to happen. Maybe the priest would say something, and my parents would be like, whoa, absolutely not, this is terrible, we're leaving. But that never happened. All of that doubt that I had, that I'd been carrying with me, it all just went away on Holy Thursday. Because my parents had to go up to St. Cyril to get their marriage blessed. We thought we'd just be signing some papers, but we kind of dressed fancy. I was in my school uniform because I was like, it's fancy enough, and we're just signing papers. But really what I didn't know is that we'd be basically just having another wedding. And so it was Father Lebsock, my parents, a witness, and myself, and we were all bawling. And it was just the most emotional, joyful day. It made me realize, I was like, oh, that's why that youth group didn't work out. Because I needed to wait for my family so I could come into the church. And it was just the best gift that I could have ever gotten. And all that doubt that I'd been carrying with me, just in seeing my parents in the most joyful possible place, it all just went away. And so on that Saturday vigil, my family and I came into the church, and I just remember I was looking up at the Eucharist, and then I was looking back at my friends who'd been there this whole time supporting me, and then I got to receive Jesus. And my life is and never will be the same. And I know this is my story, and my story is not your story, but really, whenever there's hardships and anything like that, just know that when you have Jesus, all of that stops mattering. Really what I'd like to leave you with is just this question. Do you long for Jesus? Do you long for the sacraments? Do you desire Jesus in the sacraments? Because really, when you have Jesus, nothing else matters. Thank you.
Well, Brooke, that is a very inspiring story, and I thank you very much for being able to sit down with me here.
Yeah,
but before we part ways, if there's a young person right now listening who's considering conversion, who feels this call, what would you say to them?
Answer it. Really. If you feel this call, just maybe just you have to be open to the people around you, because if you just keep it inside, you're never going to get anywhere. And like telling my parents was it was really nerve-wracking, but they were super supportive about it. And maybe it's not your parents who would be supportive, maybe it's a friend or a different relative. Just find somebody who can be your mentor and can help you with this, because you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. That's basically my message.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Brooke, and I hope you have an excellent time with the rest of the Congress.
Thank you.
If you've been listening to God for a while and feel He may be calling you to a deeper relationship, you're not alone. On a daily basis and across the world, Jesus is inviting people just like you to follow Him. So where does one begin? Many people are finding answers and a profound sense of belonging in the Catholic Church. Whether you're new to Catholicism or have been away for a while, you are always welcome home. Begin renewing your relationship with God by attending Mass and learning more about the Catholic faith. We encourage you to accept Christ's invitation and begin your faith journey today at St. Francis Xavier Parish or your local Catholic church.
So we've just finished our talk with Dr. Camosy, and it was absolutely fascinating, and you're going to hear him on here in just a second when I'm able to get him away from his adoring fans and sit him down after lunch. But we had Mass this morning with Bishop Vetter, and it was extremely touching. Even though we were in a high school gymnasium and kneeling on bleachers, there was still a very spiritual aspect to it. So it's been an excellent morning, and we are now breaking for lunch. It looks like we're having spaghetti and meatballs, one of my absolute favorite meals. After this, we're going into our breakout sessions, and the breakout sessions are kind of like individual classes on various topics. Our very own Father Victor Cancino is actually presenting here. I'm going to try to grab a picture with him at some point, but the weather here is somewhat behaving. We've still got the wind, but this morning it was just bitter cold with the snow coming in, but that was right before I left the hotel. And then coming out, there was still the wind, but the snow had stopped. So at least we have that small mercy. Full day ahead of us, and I will keep you posted as to kind of the goings on. I'm excited for this interview with Dr. Camosy and excited to see what he can share with all of you. With me today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Charles Camosy, who is a professor of bioethics at Creighton School of Medicine and a moral theology fellow at St. Joseph Seminary, and one of the keynote speakers here at the Eucharistic Congress. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on today.
Nicholas, thanks for making some time for me. After lunch, no less.
No, it took a second to pry you away from your adoring fans, but I'm glad we were able to get some time.
I just hope I have some blood left in my brain after it just went to my stomach after eating. So.
Well, how about you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself to start off with?
Well, like you mentioned, I teach at both a medical school and I teach at a seminary, so I teach future doctors and future priests, which is a wonderful thing. I feel very lucky to be able to do that. Before that, I spent 14 years at Fordham University in New York City teaching both undergraduate and graduate students in theology and bioethics. My main focus as a moral theologian is in bioethics, but I was trained broadly as a moral theologian at Notre Dame. I graduated from their doctoral program in 2008. Before that, I was a high school teacher. I taught high school theology for 3 years. Before that, I worked in the pro-life movement. I was director of communications for Pro-Life Wisconsin back in the day. I grew up in Wisconsin and in the Midwest. Now live in New Jersey, have a wonderful wife and 4 children, and just trying to make our way in the world at the moment.
You've been in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
You've got a wide breadth of perspective. But before we begin, some of our listeners may be unfamiliar with this term bioethics.
Sure.
Would you mind explaining that a little bit more?
Yeah, so bio just means life, right? So in some ways it's the ethics of life, but it tends to be something that's associated with medicine and healthcare. So when somebody says they're a bioethicist, generally what they mean is they study ethics or morality and its relationship to healthcare. Though sometimes it might be research ethics, so like if we're doing research on like embryos or animals or something, it might be those kinds of questions as well. What it means to have informed consent for research, that sort of thing. It is a very set of controversial ideas that bioethicists tend to work with. So there's been some attrition in our field, actually, because more and more people, especially in theology, would prefer to sort of steer clear of the most controversial topics, in part because it's pretty difficult to navigate the academy if you want to be a faithful Catholic with regard to these issues. So that's a challenge I face very directly, is how do you speak into an academic context, sometimes contexts which are extremely hostile to what the church teaches on these issues. If there's anybody out there that wants to study bioethics, we really need more people to do it, because the issues themselves have become more and more urgent. And frankly, the dominance of secular bioethics is almost, not quite total at this point, but something close to total at this point.
I can understand some of that hostility that you face because based on the presentations that I saw today, the idea of Catholic ethics being put into a more public space, it kind of goes against both secular sides. Like there's things about it that could probably earn the ire of both sides, but because there is no Catholic party, there is no one representation of what we would consider our Catholic ethics.
Yeah, that's very well said. I self-consciously went into this career of mine in bioethics trying my best, inspired by mentors of mine, to be clear, and colleagues of mine, friends of mine, to be clear, but also in a way just hyper concerned with saying what you just said and living out what you just said. There is no Catholic party, and actually an undue focus on secular political ideas and party politics can be a real temptation for idolatry, an attempt to sort of bend the gospel to fit a secular ideology. I probably don't need to tell you about just how prominent this is even in our church, right? To say nothing to the rest of the world. It's a struggle, as you say, because if you take stands that are authentically Catholic, you're going to get heavy fire from, there are probably more than two sides, right? But certainly multiple constituencies are going to have serious problems with what you have to say, especially if you're talking about, say, abortion and the beginning of life and the end of life with regard to physician-assisted killing on the one hand. But at the same time, if you're going to be talking about preferential option for the poor, universal destination of goods, the right to health care, then you got a whole other set of people who have lots of tough questions for you as well.
How do you best navigate this? Because as you said, it's a difficult time to be in bioethics. How do you kind of keep your center? How do you keep your calm when navigating these extremely kind of treacherous waters?
It's not easy. I'll just say that up front. It's not easy. You have to sort of steel yourself, have friends and colleagues who support you, and have a community of people to support you. I think it's also important to obviously have a significant spiritual life, prayer life. Connecting yourself at this time of year obviously is important, to connect yourself to the sufferings of Christ. We just did the Stations of the Cross to open this Eucharistic Congress yesterday. I think that was a very appropriate thing to do. It was important for me to remind myself that, without being self-aggrandizing, like I need to connect the sufferings I have with those of Christ, right? And Christ promised us this in some ways, right? He said, if you honor me, the world will hate you, right? And you can expect to suffer as a result of that. And I don't want to suffer for suffering's sake, but it should be the least surprising thing ever that faithful Catholics will suffer in these contexts. That said, this is a long answer, I'm sorry.
No.
I do think there are some reasons for hope, and I talked a little bit about those in my first talk in the cathedral. We are in a moment, I think, maybe now more than any time in my lifetime, I'm 49 years old, where the so-called right versus left fight to the death just isn't as clear as it has been in my lifetime. There's clearly a lot of polarization, right, around Trump and around the woke stuff and like whatever else name we want to give to it. Let's just not say that there aren't those problems. But the clear lines of demarcation of right versus left, fight to the death, are maybe the most unclear that they've ever been in my lifetime, right? It's not even really clear what it means to be a Republican right now. It's just a very up for grabs thing, especially after the second election of Donald Trump. I think we've seen the defeat of the fusionist Republican Party of neoconservative war hawks, libertarian, economic libertarians, and sort of religious conservatives. That has been blown up very clearly. What's going to replace it? Not clear. We got some time to figure that out. As I mentioned last night, Democrats are at something like 29%, 28% in terms of their approval rating. They are floundering. They are trying to reinvent themselves to make themselves relevant at this time. So a similar situation with them. It's not very clear what that party will end up doing. Will they embrace a kind of populism and kind of try to out-Trump Trump in some ways and say, we are the party of the working class, we are the party of the marginalized, we are not the party of the experts and privileged classes? Or will they go in another way? It's not totally clear. The reason I'm making this answer overly long is I think into that space, Catholics can project our vision in a much easier way, right? Because we don't simply say, oh, I have to either go with this side or the other side, right? It's not at all that simple. Maybe we can be, as J.D. Vance, who is a new Catholic, said at the March for Life, be explicitly against abortion and be in favor of prenatal justice, while at the same time supporting via Catholic social teaching structures and systems that make it easier not to have abortions and have larger families, and welcome children in a spirit of encounter and hospitality as opposed to marginalizing them via abortion and other ways. So that's a long way of saying, I think despite the fact that there are real structures and power structures that we can expect to get strong pushback from, there's been maybe no better time than the one right now in the last 3, 4, 5 decades to be authentically Catholic.
And a huge part of that is our expression of self, an expression of our community in the Eucharist.
That's right.
Which is the whole purpose of this Eucharistic Congress. You as a keynote presenter here, what drew you to this sort of role? What is the importance you see in your particular expertise in kind of addressing this issue?
Well, it's been interesting for me because sometimes people make fun of moral theologians as ditching all the most important stuff. We just get right into what is an indirect abortion versus a direct abortion? We don't get into the real meat of theology and sometimes it's called systematic theology. And maybe there's some truth to that critique among some of us anyway. So when I first got the invitation from a former colleague of mine, works for the diocese, got his PhD at Notre Dame also, I was glad to accept it. But I was like, man, I've never really talked about this. I've talked about Eucharistic coherence before in the sense of how should we think about, say, Catholic politicians who support abortion and how does that relate to them getting the Eucharist or not and that sort of thing. I've thought a lot about that, engaged with some of those debates. But I've not, just to be perfectly blunt, I've not really thought a lot about how a Eucharistic community, how the Eucharist itself has implications for what it is that I do. And so I had to think differently. I had to think anew sort of about this and think, well, what is it about the Eucharist that matters here? And I just was delighted to learn that so many people who are thinking about this already, as I mentioned last night, have already drawn the connections between moral theology and the Eucharist, between the Eucharist and a kind of coherent vision that brings people together around the table of the Lord, the worship of Christ, Eucharistic culture, which welcomes in a spirit of encounter and hospitality, especially the most marginalized. And Pope Francis has explicitly talked about the Eucharist in the context of resisting throwaway culture, which I wrote a whole book, the title of which was just Resisting Throwaway Culture. So once I saw that these connections were already made, it was pretty easy for me to sort of take the work that had already been done and sort of plug it into what I had been up to.
When you talk about throwaway culture, would you mind going into a little bit more of what you mean by that? Yeah,
so Pope Francis popularized the phrase, and I've been struck by it ever since, in part because I grew up with basically for most of my life St. John Paul II being the only pope I really knew. And then we had Benedict for a while, and then Pope Francis. But because I was raised essentially on JP2 stuff, I just had always thought about my pro-life work as being in the context of a culture of death. And that's not wrong. It's definitely not wrong. But I think it's fair to say that a throwaway culture is maybe more precise in some cases to describe what's going on, right? It's when somebody discards embryos they don't want after IVF, for instance. It's not that they really want those embryos to die. Sometimes, in fact, they'll just freeze them indefinitely, right? right? They just go away. Like, this is inconvenient for me. I don't want to think about this. In fact, I'll tell myself stories about how this is a embryo rather than a baby, right? We'll switch the language to make these embryos easier to discard. It's not really a culture of death in the sense that I want these embryos to die now, right? It's time for these embryos to die now. Similarly with, say, incarcerated populations, which I talked about today, or immigrant populations, it's not really that we want, by sending immigrants back to their home country where they're marked for death, that we really want them to die or something, right? It's that we find them inconvenient in our own country, and we prefer they go back to their country of origin. And if they're in a desperate situation when they get there because they're marked for death, that's not our problem, right? That's not our problem. And so throwaway culture is more like turning people, Pope Francis used it in a broad sense, but as it applies to human beings, it's turning human beings into things. It's taking a person who is unrepeatable and is an end in him or herself, and certainly not a thing, into a thing that can then be manipulated, used, discarded, sometimes violently discarded. The counterculture for that just fits so well, that it's so great to see so many people talking about the Eucharist and hospitality. The Eucharist and encounter is a counterculture of encounter and hospitality. That's the antidote to the throwaway culture. So sometimes it's easier to think about what throwaway culture is by imagining what its opposite or what the antidote is. The antidote is a culture of encounter and hospitality.
Well, and when we look at it, it's kind of a as above, so below thing, because our overall culture that we see in the secular world is as well a throwaway culture. It's entirely consumed by consumerism.
Right, exactly.
Where we get these priceless items that are full of precious metals and minerals, and then it slightly becomes inconvenient. We just toss it into the landfill and forget about it, like you said. And so we take this same thought process, this idea of commodities not having any sort of intrinsic value, and it sounds like we put that on people too.
That's right. So Pope Francis has a broader view of this, as I mentioned, that gets into our broader consumer culture and how we treat God's creation, which both Pope Francis and Benedict XVI and John Paul II were also very keen for us to understand and to respect the ecological wisdom and design that God has for creation. Pope Francis has looked at that broader culture and said, through a secularized consumerism, we've just ignored and even sometimes directly attacked God's ecological understanding of what this stuff is for. At the talk this morning, I was trying to make that case for animals, right? With animals, how we treat them in factory farms. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't think we should not eat meat, but at the very least, we should respect the animals that God has given us as the kind of creatures God made them to be, right? But instead, we turn them into things. We screw with their genetics. In fact, one thing we did to animals, I forgot to mention it this morning, is we have found a way to genetically alter chickens so they never feel full. So they eat as much and as fast as possible and get as large as fast as possible, so they be killed and used for protein units per square foot, as I mentioned, as fast as possible. This is just a direct assault on what God created in the chicken, right? Like, it's turned actually God's creation into something else, right? And then the chickens that we don't need, we discard, right? We throw away. And then, as you just mentioned, we can take the insights about what's happening there, and we can also look and see how this is being done to human beings as well.
When we look at animals, I think we can also expand that to include all of God's creation, and how we don't look at a coral reef and see something that is priceless, that has been built over centuries of life kind of dwelling there, but we just see another rock, or we see like the fish or the birds, and we say, we just assume that they're going to be there, we assume they're going to be okay, but then enact policies or ways of doing things that are detrimental to that world around us.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. I hadn't thought about that example. I sometimes think of very old trees or something as a similar kind of entity, but that's exactly right. And as you were making the case for that particular example, I was thinking, what is behind this is, as you mentioned, a consumerist understanding of almost everything, a totalizing vision of consumerism as the de facto way we imagine almost everything in the world. Like everything, that's in fact how Pope Francis talks about it. Everything has a price, right? Everything can be negotiated. Everything can be used as a mere tool or object. And the totalized, at the risk of sounding political, I try not to be political, but the neoliberal sort of there's this space out there called the marketplace, and like the market just needs to function as the market functions, and don't throw inefficiencies in to the marketplace. Just let the marketplace do what it does. I think has led to this consumer throwaway culture where we just say, well, yeah, I guess there is a price for everything, right? If it would be more efficient to let a coral reef die for various reasons, we should let the coral reef die. Or if it would be more efficient for the market to have some ancient trees be cut down, then it would be important to have the ancient trees cut down. This is what I'm trying to refer to when I talk about idolatry and the replacement of the gospel by these secular ideologies, right? To say we need to step in as Christians, as Catholics, and say, no, the only totalizing vision we have is the gospel, right? That's the ultimate and totalizing vision we have. And so the market, as happily J.D. Vance and others are talking about, the market needs to be put at the service of the human person. And if you're a theologically inclined person, a religious person, at the service of God, of right worship of God and right respect for God and God's creation. And I think we're starting to see young people move more in this direction. I think especially there are quite a few people at this event who are, conservative in the sense that they're pro-life and that they love the church and they are very faithful people, but they see the implications this has in the level of non-human ecology as well and respect for God's creation. And that is something I find just so heartening, because if we can get that right, we can be salt and light in this sort of new moment, this new political moment, in a way that could be truly effective, I think.
This also applies, as you were talking about today, of older people, where we look at them and we say they've exhausted their usefulness, or they have, as a commodity, or they have become a burden or an inconvenience. Would you mind touching on that a little bit?
Well, thank you for asking. That's how I finished my second talk today. Was almost like a call to, not arms, but some sort of alarm-sounding attempt to say we have a dementia crisis especially. Well, we had an elder care crisis more broadly, but within that elder crisis, there's a dementia crisis where, and this connects to some of the moral status questions at the beginning of life, where we have clearly living human beings who have lost the abilities that our consumer culture values in them, right? So rationality, self-awareness, productivity, which again, in our consumer culture, in our market-centered culture, in our neoliberal culture, that's how we tend to understand value, right? What can you contribute to the market? Are you a net benefit? Are you a productive member of society, right? Or are you a burden, right? Somebody that is an inefficiency, someone that might demand more in terms of social support than others, and then you're at risk of being thrown away. And this is true of many kinds of people, but it's definitely true at the end of life, and it's definitely true of people with dementia, as I was trying to make the case for in my talk. We have a massive problem already with caring for people with dementia, but it's only going to get worse. The number of people with dementia is going to double in the next 20 years, triple in the next 30 years, and we're already putting them on antipsychotic meds because it gives them, which is essentially a chemical straitjacket, because there aren't enough people in the nursing home to actually care for them. Doubles their chances of death, etc. Mm-hmm. And more people are, in light of this, is it too strong to call it a catastrophe, suggesting maybe it'd be better if these people could just kill themselves, right? Wouldn't it be better to have physician-assisted killing for these people? And before you say that's just like the pro-life Catholic theologian talking, the state of California tried to expand their physician-assisted killing bill to include people with dementia last year, and they're trying again this year. And Canada, other countries are already doing this. And you can just see the writing on the wall. If we don't have a specific move to change our structures and systems around this, we're going to move towards physician-assisted killing at a massive scale towards this population.
Well, sometimes it seems like there's a lot of resistance to us trying to build God's world, kind of bring in God's kingdom. And especially with these issues that you've been talking about, it can seem kind of an insurmountable thing. But as the Jubilee year this year teaches us, the focus on hope, the focus on the future, what sort of hope can you offer us? What sort of practical ways forward can we as Catholics take to be more true to this Eucharistic vision?
Yeah. On the one hand, I grew up thinking about these questions as a pro-life activist focused on secular laws and secular institutions. And I still think we can have an impact there. So we definitely need to do things like make it easier to care for our loved ones in our own homes, as opposed to just sort of discarding them into places where they're giving chemical straitjackets and being cared for by robots or cable news or something like this, right? And never see their families, and which exacerbates the problems with dementia and also death. And there are things we can do, and it's low-hanging fruit, actually. We can, for instance, change the way we reimburse families who have insurance that helps them take care of their loved ones or take care of themselves, right, when they get older. Right now, there isn't enough opportunity to take care of loved ones at home via that kind of insurance, whether it's government or private. If we just change some sort of policies around this, we can actually save money by taking care of loved ones at home. We can do things the elderly and their family want, which is to be around their loved ones more often anyway. So we can save money by actually giving people more of what they want, and they don't die as quickly, and the dementia doesn't progress as fast. Seems like a no-brainer, right? So I don't want to say there's nothing to do with regard to sort of secular policies and secular politics. There are things to do. That said, when it comes to the really controversial questions, like do people with dementia who have lost their rationality and self-awareness and memories and are a net burden on the culture, do they really count the same as other people, right? I'm not sure we're going to win that battle, right? Unless we have a religious revival of some kind, right? And maybe we're moving in that direction. I'm open to that idea. But if we're losing that cultural battle, then I think we need to focus anew on not just working with secular structures and institutions and politics. We need to build our own structures and systems, right? And create our own Eucharistic cultures of coherence and encounter and hospitality. And as I was saying in the actually both sets of remarks, we used to do that as a Catholic Church in the United States. We used to be much more willing to say, this thing that we need doesn't exist. I'm not going to lobby my congressman or my senator to do it. We're going to build it. The Catholic Church is going to build this thing. We needed schools because we couldn't get a fair shake in public schools. We built our own schools. We didn't have enough hospitals in our communities. We built our own hospitals. There were whole communal ecosystems of life at almost every level that were deeply, profoundly Catholic. And so I'm not calling for a retreat from the world or what some people might call the Benedict option or something like that, though this might be akin to something like that. It's that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We can work with secular structures and systems while at the same time, hey, let's revive this muscle memory we have as church in the United States to say, if it's not there, let's build it ourselves.
And like you were saying, in the post-Civil War era, for instance, there were a lot of institutions that were around to take care of other communities, but you didn't find any that were Catholic oriented or even were Catholic exclusionary, which is why the Knights of Columbus came up. It was this Catholic organization that said, we're going to step in and take over this need that we see for our community.
That's right. And along with them were Catholic women religious, many of whom came into their own during the Civil War. They served as Secretary Stanton at the time was looking around for people who could be nurses for the Civil War, and it turned out, hey, Catholic women religious. They were actually the ones that taught Nightingale everything she knew. So we own nursing actually as a Catholic church. Not enough people know that. Not enough people are acting like we should. That's true. Who built all the early institutions of healthcare in the United States? It was Catholic women religious. And many of them still, you even hear the names in any institution that has mercy in it probably was a product, say, of the Sisters of Mercy, right? And there's way more than just that. So yes, I love to point to that era up until about, World War II maybe, especially as Catholics started to gain positions of power in the culture and become fully sort of immersed in the culture and the structures of power in the culture. We sort of lost that muscle memory maybe of doing these things ourselves, and we maybe instinctually say the way to go is to lobby your congressman, run for office, try to make change at that level. And again, hear me very clearly. I'm saying let's still try to do that, but we don't need to choose between that and building new things ourselves, including, as I said towards the end of my remarks, our own care institution for the elderly. We have some, but they're kind of in a secularized model. Some are okay and good, but others just simply adopt the model of putting old people away from the rest of the culture and they're desperately lonely. Why can't we build our own institutions that are interwoven with the rest of the parish and diocesan community. If somebody does need to be cared for in a way that's outside of the home, let's have that institution, if it's Catholic run, be in a Eucharistic community together.
We're coming to the end of our time here, but do you have any closing thoughts for our listeners, some message to go forth with?
I guess the importance of community in all of this, right? So we're trying to think about the Eucharistic community here. When you're trying to figure this out on your own and it's just you maybe on a long ride listening to a podcast trying to figure this out for yourself, there's some good that could come from that, right? You might even make some commitments, as if you're like me, taking long drives and listening to podcasts like this one. But the real benefit for me is having a community around me, a supportive community around me who knows of my commitments and is willing to call me out when I'm not living up to those commitments. I was joking earlier that some people who follow me on social media say that I have a different affect when I'm giving a talk in person than what is on Twitter, which may be a kind way of saying maybe you need to cool it on Twitter a little bit, Camosy, right? Those kind of brotherly, fraternal corrections are helpful because we are sinful creatures and we're self-interested creatures, and it's that Eucharistic community around us that can maybe be the one to say, hey, Charlie, cool it on Twitter, or you say you have this commitment, it doesn't seem to be coming out the way that you might expect, or so having a intentional community around you and with you that shares these commitments is almost as important as having the commitments themselves, I think.
Strong words and inspiring words, Doctor, and I appreciate you very much making the time for us today.
That was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Whew. So we've just finished up with the breakout sessions, and we're preparing for our little break here and then on to supper. But I had to miss the first of the 3 breakout sessions because I was interviewing Dr. Camosy, who you heard from earlier this episode. But I went to 2 of the other ones, and they were absolutely outstanding. The first one was with Dr. Hemphill, who you'll be hearing from in the next episode. But her talk was outstanding, and then we're preparing to hear her give another keynote talk this evening, right after supper. But then, right after that, I went to a breakout session with some Dominican sisters, who you'll hear from in just a moment. And this whole experience has been so invigorating on a spiritual level. My body is exhausted, and I am ready for some rest, but spiritually speaking, I am refreshed. This Eucharistic Congress has just been amazing. So if you have been thinking about attending one in your local diocese, or even here in the Diocese of Helena, golly, I would recommend it. It has been such a blessing to be here and to meet with these amazing people. I forget sometimes, if I can go on a small tangent, how lucky I am to be able to be in this ministry and be able to do these shows for y'all, because it hardly is work sometimes. I get to sit down and have the most interesting conversations with the most interesting people. And I feel very blessed to be in this ministry, and I'm very grateful to all of you who listen to this podcast, who are able to get something from it. I know that we've had some people who have converted after listening to this podcast and coming to understand Catholicism in a deeper way. We've certainly had some reverts, people who have been away from the church and have come back to it because of various reasons, but I've heard some of them talking about how this podcast has been contributing to that, and you just have no idea how much that builds me up, not in a prideful way, I don't think, but in a way that is thankful to be here with you, thankful to be here at this Eucharistic Congress, and thankful to be continuing this ministry. So thank you to everybody who supports this podcast and everything that we're able to do with it. But yeah, I'm eager to share more stories with you as we go throughout this, and yeah, so soon you'll be hearing from these wonderful Dominican sisters, Anne Catherine and Mariana, and yeah, Well, we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the evening as we close out the night and with some final thoughts. But yeah, I just wanted to take this moment to say thank you and to tell you that we're looking forward to continuing this. So God bless you. Right now, I have the privilege of sitting down with Sisters Anne Catherine and Mariana of the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia. Sisters, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nicholas.
I appreciate y'all making the time to sit down with me. So before we get started, would you mind telling the listeners a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. I'm a Dominican sister of St. Cecilia. Our congregation is based in Nashville, Tennessee. We've been around since 1860, and I've been a member of our community for 27 years.
And I entered the convent about 20 years ago.
All right. What brought you to your vocations? What pulled you into this ministry, this lifestyle, the religious life?
Around the time when I was in college, just the whole idea of vocation was very much on my mind. I had determined that I was called to get married and have a family. But then over time was learning that actually I needed to ask the Lord what He was calling me to. Just over a number of experiences, realized that He was calling me to religious life, and visited several different groups of sisters, including our own congregation, of course, the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia. And I noticed that when I was with our sisters, I had just this sense of connection to them. I felt like I had something in common with them. I learned about a little bit about Dominican way of life, and as I heard all those different principles, it really resonated with me, and I thought, if the Lord's calling me to be a religious sister, it's got to be a Dominican. And with much prayer and receiving the sacraments and going to Mass often and going to confession, the Lord really did reveal to me that He was calling me to this life.
How about yourself?
Well, I was thinking when you asked the question, how did you get to this life, I just thought, God.
Oh, there you go.
I really think it was certainly not my idea. I think a vocation is really something God initiates and we respond. So it came to me really as a total surprise, and I just assumed, I grew up Catholic in a Catholic family from Cincinnati, Ohio, assumed I was going to get married. I gratefully had a beautiful witness in my own family of good parents with a beautiful marriage, so I just assumed that was God's path for me. Through prayer, really, and learning to develop what I think now I just would consider a friendship with Jesus, that when I grew up I didn't really know. I went to Mass with my family on Sunday and all of that, but Jesus was not a person and somebody real in my life. But in my 20s, and I was a teacher early on, and just really developing that life through a life of prayer, especially spending time with Him in adoration, gently this question began to come up in my heart, like, what does God want for your life? And then I just felt this quiet invitation, like, okay, you could get married, and yet there is this other thing. And the more I learned about religious life, I also, like Sister Mariana, went to visit our sisters in Nashville. I'd never been to a convent before, and so I think in my case, I didn't really know I had a vocation until I saw the life being lived, and it really resonated in my heart. And then when I felt the Lord asking Him to come follow me, I also knew, oh yes, as a Dominican sister. So I'm so grateful.
Well, what do y'all think about our lovely Montana weather that we've been treating you with?
Well, we came with all manner of different layers, sweaters, jackets, wanted to be prepared for everything. Enjoyed the snow that we saw this morning. But really, I think even in whether it's warm or cold, what really captures our attention is just those beautiful mountains. Sister and I just keep, looking at them, taking pictures of them, and realizing that as much as we'll want to communicate to the sisters when we get back to the mother house how beautiful Montana is, a picture can never do it justice. But we've just been loving every minute here.
Yes, we laugh. We okay, we put a jacket on, we take a jacket off. We put the sweater and the jacket on, we take that off. So, but really, it's this is my first visit to your beautiful state, and it is. greatly longed to come here for a long time because of the natural beauty, and it has not disappointed.
Excellent. At this Eucharistic Congress, I've had the chance to talk to a lot of fascinating people who have been called here from a lot of different walks of life. How do two Dominican sisters from Nashville end up giving a presentation at a Eucharistic Congress in Montana?
Well, we got asked,
That'll do it.
and we said yes. As many people in your diocese have said, there is not a strong presence of religious life in this diocese, and so we were very happy to oblige. You know, I think they wanted the presence of really the fullness of all the vocations in the church at this Congress. So obviously under the leadership of Bishop Vedder, who's been so present, it's really an example, very edifying. But beautiful married couples, wonderful, vibrant priests. And so we're so grateful to be asked, because there are beautiful vocations, different vocations in the church, and I think religious life is the complement to kind of round out the total picture of the body of Christ.
Sure. No, I think it's excellent to have that presence here. Like you say, we don't have a whole lot of nuns or monks or anything along those lines. We have some secular Franciscans or the kind of who live around, but no, you're kind of a excellent oddity to have around here. So at this Eucharistic Congress, you are here to kind of talk about Pope Francis's Pilgrims of Hope, the kind of the theme for this year of Jubilee. You told an excellent story, speaking of mountains, during the presentation. Would you mind sharing that again for the listeners?
Sure. So when Sister and Catherine and I were talking about coming out here to Montana, Sister was telling me it's going to be my first visit there. I can't wait to see those mountains. And I actually had the privilege of spending 6 years in Bremerton, Washington. And the sisters and I there, we went on many, many hikes. And we were just, of course, like here in Montana, surrounded by so much natural beauty. And one of the sisters really wanted to do this particular hike called Mailbox Peak. At the time, this was at the beginning of our hiking adventures. 2 of us, myself and the other sister, new to hiking. And this third sister, she had actually done quite a bit of hiking, because we also have a convent in Denver, and she had hiked many of those mountains. And she said, I really want us to do Mailbox Peak. And she said there's about an elevation gain of about, I think it's something like 4,500 feet. Now, fortunately, Sister Daniela and I, the ones that, are kind of new to hiking, the amateurs, that didn't really mean much to us because we didn't have a lot of experience yet. So we get to Mailbox Peak, we get to the start of the trail, and there are actually many people hiking that day, which always kind of brings me some comfort. There's a lot of people. The trail's getting packed down because it was very snowy. It was in February, and we're hiking along, and the Sister Racheli, who was the one that really had all the experience, she just said, Sister, you just go ahead, because she had that capability. I said, you go ahead of us. We had been with each other for a good portion of the way, but I said, you just go, and we'll meet you at the top. And so Sister Daniela and I, we kept, plodding along, and after a while you get kind of tired, and I just kept thinking, I know we can do this. Like, I know that we can summit this mountain, but you can kind of start to get a little bit discouraged, because again, your muscles are starting to hurt, you're breathing a little heavier, and as people were walking by who had already summited and were clearly on the descent, you'd say, okay, about how much longer do you think we have before we make it to the top? And they'd kind of give you an estimate. And I remember this one particular part where it was kind of more of a wooded area. I think occasionally the mountains would burst forth. You'd get a great view of them, but just kind of enclosed by the trees and the beautiful snow. And I looked at Sister and I said, Sister, this is going to make no sense to you probably, but I think we need to run just to do something different and to maybe make it feel like we're going to get there a little sooner. So we ran a little bit, walked, ran a little bit, walked. Of course, we couldn't do that, couldn't sustain that for too long, but just to add a little variety to what we were doing. And fortunately, eventually, the horizon opened and we could see the summit. And when we saw it, of course, we were very happy, but we also saw that we actually still had quite a trek to get to the top. It was quite steep, very doable, but we knew that that last leg was going to really require some energy and some strength. And so Sister Daniela, actually, I looking back now, just can laugh about it. You know, we had our hiking backpacks on, and she said, I'm leaving this thing here at the bottom. She's like, I just want to go up lighter. It might, you know, be a little easier. And so she, you know, we transferred her food to my pack, and then we left her backpack there. We knew it'd be okay. And we start going up, and we in fact did summit. We got to the top. There is a mailbox there. Of course, you know, after all that work, trying so hard, you just have this great sense of accomplishment there at the summit. The reward of just that absolute, just stunning beauty. You're just completely surrounded, taking it all in, and then also just on a natural level, you're ready to eat lunch, and you're sitting down, and that food tastes so good because you know you've been working so hard to get there. And Sister and I were talking about, you know, hiking, especially hiking mountains, how that really is such a good image of the virtue of hope. It's hard to not, you know, think of Pier Giorgio Frassati. He's going to be canonized this August. He died in the year 1925, and he was a great lover of the outdoors. He loved to hike. He loved to hike mountains, and there's this wonderful picture of him that not long before he died, and I guess someone gave him this picture, and he wrote a phrase on it in Italian. He was an Italian man, and it said verso l'alto, which means to the heights in English. That so beautifully encapsulates Pier Giorgio Frassati's kind of outlook on life in two ways. One way, just in that adventurous spirit he had, like to the heights, like I see that mountain and I want to hike it and I want to get to the top. I'm willing to put in the effort to do that. But then even deeper than that, Pier Giorgio had this great desire to reach the summit of all summits, which is heaven. So Pier Giorgio could see that his great, you know, desire to summit these mountains really pointed to a deeper desire in his heart to be in heaven, right? The ultimate summit. And so we think about hiking, it's arduous, and there's a good there for you. You've got that good of reaching the top, and you see that it is possible. But once we got to the summit of Mailbox Peak, we knew we couldn't stay there, right? You had to go back down the mountain. So that summiting of that mountain couldn't last forever, right? There's kind of almost that little, almost for me, it was always a little bit of a sadness when we would summit a mountain and then have to start going back down because you work so hard to get up there and then you don't get to really stay too long and you've got to leave it. But then on the flip side, with heaven, that's going to last forever. That's going to be a summit that will never end. So we want to not put our hope on the things of this earth that will not last forever, but we want to put our hope in heaven, that Jesus is our hope. That union with him that we'll have in heaven will last forever and is going to completely satisfy us. Whereas summiting a mountain, as wonderful as it is, you're always left wanting more. Always left wanting more. But that won't be the case with heaven. We'll be fully satisfied there because that's what we're made for.
And as I picture you hiking up to the top of this summit with your backpack and everything, I can't help but think of the theme for this year, the Pilgrims of Hope. Being a pilgrim isn't an easy walk. Right. It's not supposed to be like, oh, I'm just going to walk across the street to the convenience store, and I'm going to walk back, and that makes me a pilgrim. Mm-hmm. No, being a pilgrim means that we're traveling in an arduous way, yeah. But we're doing so with this feeling of hope. Mm-hmm. How do we sustain that? I mean, this world has so many uphill struggles, so many resistances to us, so many ways of dashing our hopes. How do we keep it afloat?
You know, the hope is the virtue of the pilgrim, and it is something, you're right, like it's all about, our life is a journey, and we recognize we're not just like the difference you said going across to the store and coming back, but we're headed somewhere so important, something that's not going to disappoint. As Sister Mariana said, we're headed to heaven. But heaven isn't just an abstract place. It's a place where Pope Benedict reminds us we are known, we are loved, we are awaited by a person who is love himself, who came to earth to be a pilgrim with us, to walk with us, to save us. So how do we sustain hope? I mean, I think the beauty of the theological virtue of hope, which is different than like a natural confidence or optimism, is hope is really rooted in life in Christ himself. And so, by virtue of our baptism, we have received the theological virtue of hope. But then we try to nourish it and sustain it, mostly through a life of prayer. Prayer is like an anchor, as St. Thomas Aquinas reminds us. It's an anchor that actually latches onto the rock of Christ who's in heaven. And so if we spend time every day talking to the Lord, sharing with Him our desires, our sadnesses, our disappointments, that He gives us the strength. I think that's the difference between natural hope and supernatural hope. And that's what the Catechism reminds us, is it's not about us. It's not about the difference between the analogy of summiting the mountain is somebody who's maybe a little weaker or who doesn't have the lung capacity can't get up there. But with God, anything is possible. So it's like He gives us a turbo pack to strap on and reach Him, or it's like He sometimes picks us up and takes us because we're too weak to go on our own. So I think that's what hope gives us, is like Christ reminding us, you are never alone. I'm never going to abandon you. And with me, we can do it.
And to think that we can get there on our own with no help whatsoever, well, that's Pelagianism.
Yes,
right there.
absolutely. Yeah.
But we know that grace is not deserved. The top of the mountain isn't deserved. And yet God wants us to get there anyways.
He wants us. He wants nothing more than to give us. I think we're so grateful as Dominicans to have St. Thomas Aquinas as one of our great theologians, and St. Thomas has such a confidence about who we are as human persons made in the image and likeness of God. It's not like God stands afar from us. He is so with us, and He desires nothing more than to give us the theological virtues, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Like, I always think it is a power pack of His divine life to bring us to Himself, where eternal happiness with Him will be ours.
So in your own lives, how do you cultivate this hope? Obviously, we have prayer, a life of prayer that is available to us as Catholics, to us as Christians. But what else is there? What else can we do in a practical way to cultivate this hope?
I think for sure reading the lives of the saints often. So I mentioned Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, such a wonderful example, especially for young people, but for people of all ages. We can never exhaust the saints. There are so many saints from different walks of life and just all the manner of different things that the Lord called them to. They kept their gaze on Christ. They kept their gaze on heaven, and by reading their lives, they can help us to do the same, to keep our attention on Jesus, to keep our attention on our true home, which is heaven. I think also just some really super simple things, but can really have great impact is, really living the liturgical life. When feast days come along, to, in your home, you can celebrate them very simply, but celebrate them as a family. Maybe you have a special meal, or you set up a little mini kind of prayer space in your house, but just to keep reminding us of our lives of faith. We learn through the material, we learn through our senses. So having these physical things in our midst to help draw our gaze to heaven. So one example that we've been giving during this Congress is celebrating your baptismal birthday. I don't know how common that is to know the date I was baptized, and every year when it comes around, to celebrate in some way. Just to thank God, and it calls to mind that great gift that I received in my baptism, that I became a child of God. It's so easy to forget these things. So to celebrate our baptismal birthday every year, making sure that, when those, even just those small little sufferings come in our lives, those little challenges, that phrase, offer it up, and not to do it in kind of this curmudgeon way, but to unite our sufferings, whether they're little or small, unite them to Christ's sufferings on the cross, because we know that His suffering led to the resurrection, led to life, and our sufferings can do the same.
I also think words matter. Praying an act of hope, it actually can communicate an efficacious grace that we can say, we pray for God's help in our lives. And so I think the church, often says to pray the acts of faith, hope, and love, so that we can strengthen. Because sometimes, how do virtues grow in us? Well, we exercise them like a muscle, and we also ask God for help. We ask Him to keep pouring His life into our soul. So I think ask for Him. And I also think we would be remiss, especially at this Eucharistic Congress, if we didn't mention staying close to Christ, especially through reception of Holy Communion. Well, through adoration, where we look at Him, we speak to Him, we adore Him and thank Him. But I think also through preparing ourselves. If we're not ready, we go to confession, get scrubbed up, and then really receive the Holy Eucharist, which really is the bread of the pilgrim. It is the bread of the wayfarer. It is the food that sustains us on our life. Sister Mariana gave the example of summiting Mailbox Peak. They would have to stop along the way and eat a snack. And when you got to the top, you eat. We know that the Eucharist is our gift now to sustain us when we're on our way. And in heaven, we know that we'll have union with Christ in the fullness. So it shows us what will be seen in in the fullness of everything in heaven.
Well, you actually just preempted the question that I was preparing to ask, which is, when we talk about this Eucharistic Congress, where does hope and the Eucharist, where do they coincide? And I think the simple answer is everywhere, in absolutely every aspect of it.
And I think also, too, the sacraments are so beautiful because, as Sister Mariana said, Christ comes to us so often through the material, through what we see, what we sense, what we taste. We receive a physical food through the Holy Eucharist, but we also receive a spiritual food that nourishes our soul. And that's where the virtue of hope grows then, because it is at the level of the soul, because it is Christ's life, His grace poured into us to make us stronger, to increase our desire to see Him, to be one with Him, and we are one with Him when we receive Him in Holy Communion.
Our listeners are eager to hear what final words you might have in this way. What kind of message would you give to folks who may be struggling with hope, who may be struggling to see how impactful the Eucharist could be? What would you say to them?
I would say to not be afraid to let the Lord know that if they are struggling, talk to Him about it. I think that's the key, is to keep that relationship going, right? It could be tempted to maybe turn away, or to think that in some way any maybe type of discouragement that we're having could make the Lord not want to be close to us, but our suffering, it draws Him to us. So to keep that pipeline of communication with Him, to keep that prayer life going, even when you might feel like you're getting nothing out of it. The reality is you are. You might not feel it, but down the road you'll probably be able to see just what the Lord was doing in your life. So just stay close to Him, even when it doesn't feel like He's close to you. He is. To keep receiving the Eucharist, every Sunday, or if you're able to go to Mass during the week, and popping in if you have an adoration chapel at your parish. Just keeping that relationship alive. Keeping that relationship alive, I think, is definitely very, very important.
Yeah. And I would say the virtue of patience. One of the fruits of the Holy Spirit is what we call long-suffering, which I think is to really take the long view, to realize that God sometimes works in a very quiet and hidden way in our lives that we don't see. So not to give up too fast. And I think certainly receiving our Lord helps give us the strength to do that. I love Romans 8:28, where St. Paul tells us, that God makes all things work to the good for those who love Him. So really trusting that, God, can you make something good out of this mess? Or it feels like things are pretty dark right now. But just really praying that simple prayer from St. Faustina and the Divine Mercy, Jesus, I trust in you, that to ask God for patience, to just sit around and be able to wait and see, because He's going to make good things happen.
Beautiful. Well, sisters, we were lucky to have you. I'm glad you made the trek here from Nashville. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today and sharing some words of wisdom with our listeners as well.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Yes, thank you so much.
I've just gotten back to the hotel, and I wanted to leave with a few thoughts before I crash out for the evening. First off, I cannot wait to share Dr. Hemphill's mind with you tomorrow. I went to one of her talks during the last breakout session, and then she was the keynote speaker for the last general session last night. And brilliant person with a very keen insight into the Eucharist and its importance to our faith, to our religion. And so I'm looking forward to catching up with her after the final session tomorrow and having that kind of be the cherry on the cake of this wonderful experience. Good night to everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you for being with us today as we walk as pilgrims this road together. If you feel called to learn more, please consider checking out St. Francis Xavier or your local Catholic church. All are welcome into our community as God loves us all equally. If you are interested in supporting the Vox SFX podcast, please visit sfxmissoula.org/donate. Until next time, go forth in peace and be the light of Christ in someone's day.